online for joining us and choosing to spend this hour with us. It is really our pleasure to get to talk about something that we both feel very passionate about. We were going to start by saying something about us, but you did a brilliant introduction, so there's really not much more. So we're just going to go ahead and dive in. And as you can see on the slide, the title that we have given this webinar is Living with Parkinson's. Is there an app for that? And I think we could all agree that technology has really changed the way we live. I recently traveled and came back just on Sunday. And on the plane, I was sitting next to this little girl, and her mom just gave her the magazine, like the airplane magazine, to just entertain her throughout takeoff. And I watched this girl trying to scroll through the magazine as if it was an iPad. And then she got very frustrated and telling her mom that it wasn't working. And it was just really interesting to me. I thought it was very funny, but just really telling of the way that technology has really transformed the way we think and the way we interact with the world. So Mike and I wanted to really spend this hour talking about what does that mean for us. So for you, if you're a person living with Parkinson's disease, for you, if you're a caregiver or have a loved one that is living with Parkinson's, or if you're a therapist or a clinician or a researcher that is partnering with people that are living with Parkinson's. So how do we navigate this ocean of information, and how do we make sure that we use it appropriately and that technology is actually enhancing our opportunities and our participation and not perhaps causing harm? So before we begin, we just have a few disclaimers which are going to come up in the screen in a second. So the first one is that some apps are going to be discussed throughout this webinar as examples, and so at the end of this talk we're going to go through some examples of, according to this criteria of how to evaluate the quality and appropriateness of an app, whether they're good or bad examples. But we want to make sure that you know that we have no financial interest or affiliation with these apps or their developers at all. In fact, these apps don't even know they're being mentioned. So they're really just there for the purposes of examples. By including them in this webinar, we are not recommending or supporting or giving any type of endorsement for their use or implementation. And we do recommend that you please discuss all healthcare information and tools with your healthcare professionals or teams. And if any of this is useful, absolutely share it with them. But please do make sure that your healthcare information is discussed with your professionals. Now, in terms of what we're going to be looking at, we're going to do a briefly overview of apps, what are their advantages and disadvantages, and then we're going to dive into evaluating the apps. How do we determine if an app is right? How can you determine if an app is right for you? We're going to give you some practical tools and questions that you can ask yourself about the app to determine its quality, and then we're going to go through a few examples using that criteria and show you what we believe are examples of apps that are perhaps positive and could actually provide support, and others that may not necessarily be what we are looking for. So let's dive in. As you can see on that screen, Mike actually created this screen, and I really like it because I think I see it, and that's exactly how I feel when I open my app store. So if any of you have iPads or smartphones, or you have children that do, or friends that do, you have probably had some scenario that looks like, oh, look, I downloaded this app, and it's great. It allows me to do this. It seems that now everything we do is through an app. In fact, and this is March of 2017 information. You can see this is the number of apps that is available in the leading app stores of each of the operation systems of phones and devices. So you can see, for example, that just Google Play, which is available on Android platforms, has 2,800,000 apps available on their store. That means that if you have an Android phone, if you have a Samsung, if you have a Nexus, and you go to your app store, that's approximately the amount of apps that you will find. If you're a Mac person and you have an iPhone or an iPad, you'll probably find more than 2,200,000. And it was interesting, just before the webinar started, Mike and I were chatting about this, and he pointed out that this information is already outdated because, as we know, even as we speak, there's more apps that are being launched and developed. But this is just to give us a sense of how much is out there. In fact, we just last week did a search, so using these keywords that you see there on Google, so Parkinson's disease and apps, this is what we found. As you can see, there was about 500 58,000 results in under a second. So this is just to showcase, this is how much information you are having to sort out and to decide whether something is helpful for you. So how do we go about that? In order to know that, we first need to understand what they are, and we actually want to just give you a sense of what clinicians are saying in terms of evidence and what they're feeling about recommending apps to their patients or their clients. So in terms of mobile health apps, which is basically what we're focusing on for this webinar, and they're called mHealth apps, so apps that are developed and launched with the purpose of supporting someone's health, including people living with Parkinson's. They are actually predicted to be the fastest growing segment of healthcare apps through 2020. So we are talking about chronic apps developed for people living with chronic conditions being the market that is growing at the most rapid rate. So that means that every year you're going to have more information to sort through. There's also recent studies that tell us that 93% of physicians feel that mHealth apps can boost a patient's healthcare outcome. So clinicians are feeling very positive about this. And we, as involved in education of therapists and clinicians, we are certainly trying to incorporate this. Mike actually has worked with our students in trying to teach them the skills to determine whether an app is appropriate for their clients and working with their clients to sort that out. So you are going to increasingly encounter physicians or healthcare professionals that may recommend apps as part of their services to you. And then in those same studies, 89% of physicians said they would likely recommend a health app to their patients. And some of you may have already experienced this. Your physicians may already be doing this. In other situations, some of you may have brought an app to your healthcare professional to discuss it and to determine whether they would agree or not with you that this is a good choice for you. But not everything is as great as it sounds. So as much as clinicians are feeling very positive, we also know that recently a study in the US looked at 100 hospitals and it saw that only 2%, there was an only 2% client usage rate. So even though physicians, 86% were recommending them, 93% were feeling quite positive about them, patients were only 2% of patients were actually using those apps. And when they inquired about the reasons, is because they felt the apps were not meeting their expectations. So they were being recommended by the professional, but then the person took them home and it was really not what they were expecting. One of the most cited reasons for that was that the app functionality is dependent on the environment in which it is used. So perhaps the person felt that while they were in therapy or with their physician, it seemed to make sense and it worked, but once they were home and on their own, it no longer did what it was supposed to, or it did not meet the expectations they had. But even more concerning for us is that this was also another reason that was quoted. Problems with accuracy were reported. And this is not just in these studies, but other studies are seeing the same. Some of these apps are being launched with a specific purpose, and at the end of the day, they're not actually accurately helping people track their health. And that is very concerning, and that is the compelling reason why we believe talking about quality of apps, and equipping all of us, like interacting and dialoguing about this, is so important. So what are the key messages and rationale for why we decided to do this webinar? Technology is playing an increasing important role in the lives of the population, all of yours, all of ours. There are millions of apps on different platforms that are available for use. They're being used by people living with Parkinson's disease and their families, as we saw on that search. They're being specifically developed for people living with PD today. And there are benefits to their use, but quality is definitely a concern. So when we say that there are benefits to their use, but quality is a concern, what do we mean by that? What are the advantages and disadvantages of using apps as part of your healthcare tracking, monitoring, and even your improvement in terms of the outcomes that you have chosen and that are meaningful to you? So let's look at some of the disadvantages and advantages. In terms of disadvantages of using apps, It requires a mobile device. Now, some of you may feel very comfortable using devices, but some of you may have just started. Some of you may have situations where you have been reluctant to use one, but your family has encouraged the use. But it definitely is a disadvantage that we do depend on a device for their use. And those devices are also dependent on a power source. So we are also dependent on our ability to charge. And if you have a smartphone, I think you probably have experienced this, that one of the worst things that can happen now is when your phone is running out of battery. I have everything on my phone, and when I don't have battery, I feel like naked. Like I have no idea what's happening. Am I late for a meeting? Where am I supposed to be? Who am I? Like it becomes like an existential problem. So if you have a phone, you probably have experienced this great disadvantage. It requires familiarity with mobile technologies. So you need to feel comfortable. You need to feel competent in their use to be able to enjoy the benefits that the app is giving you. There's a lot of system and app updates and different bugs that can impact the experience. We have all probably also experienced when our phones start telling us that the apps are out of date and there's updates and updates and updates and that it needs backup. And so you need to be coping with those as well. Some apps may include advertisements, which can be not only annoying but very intrusive, and it can really impact our experience of the apps. And then some of them have increasingly smaller screens and buttons, and some of you may have experienced this, but sometimes it's really hard to interact with devices when the keyboards on the screen or even in our phones are really not conducive, and that may also present a disadvantage. What about the advantage? So in spite of all of this and our annoyance with power and updates and keeping up with all of them, there are advantages to their use, but one thing to keep in mind is also that cost may be a problem. So we're going to discuss the advantages, but we want you to keep in mind that the relative cost of apps, we recognize that is a challenge. And so even when we talk about apps that are positive and maybe a good example, we recognize that the fact that we have to pay for them may limit their access in all situations. And that's definitely something that more advocacy is needed from different organizations for clients and their families to be able to increase equity and access to these tools. So in terms of advantages, devices are portable, so that's something that they have over computers. We can take them anywhere on vacation, on holidays. They may be easier to access than other devices, so it may be easier to have a customized phone that is right for you, that you're comfortable with the keyboard, as opposed to other devices that are also bigger. Some apps, although they do have a cost, some of them are becoming increasingly cheaper. I think because the market is being flooded with apps, app developers are recognizing that either they have to keep their costs really down or they're not going to be successful in this market. Many apps are frequently updated by their developers, and that is good news. Even though sometimes the updates are annoying, it is good to know that you have an app in your hands that is being monitored and that any issues or bugs are actually being fixed and attended to, other than just launching it into the market and letting it do any damage that it might. And they reduce the number of aids or devices used for different occupations. And some of you may have experienced this in the past or even currently, where several professionals are recommending different things, and so you're having to use multiple devices that are going to help you with tracking your health, blood pressure, medications, reminders, appointments, even motor recommendations or cognition or those sorts of things. And having everything in one platform certainly reduces the burden of that. So in summary, for this point, we recognize that apps are not appropriate for every person and every situation or every stage of life. And by this, I think we really want to also encourage you to, if you feel that an app is not right for you, even if your physician is recommending, make sure that you're having a good conversation with them as to what the challenges are and what you feel a better, more suitable alternative would be for you. Still, much research is needed to demonstrate the effectiveness of apps, and certainly, I think Mike and I can tell you this, we cannot keep up with developers. Apps are being launched and developed at a rate that research cannot possibly keep up in terms of doing the studies that are required to back these apps. And some of these apps are more like scheduling and monitoring, so they may not necessarily cause harm if effectiveness has not been demonstrated. But as we're going to see in the examples, there are actually apps that may be detrimental to your health, and until more research is done, it is important that we are working with some foundational quality considerations. And guidance is needed to assess the quality of apps and to discuss how to choose a good and an appropriate app. And that is what we're going to dive right into. And so I'm going to hand it over to Mike to walk us through those criteria.
All right. Thank you very much, Lily. That was a great introduction for us to the use of apps generally and mobile devices and some advantages and disadvantages of them. So right now we're going to switch gears and start to talk about those specific criteria that we can use to evaluate the quality of the apps. So actually putting the apps under the microscope, so to speak. And there's three main considerations that need to be taken into account when we evaluate apps. We'll talk about two of them. So we're going to be talking about how to evaluate the quality of apps, but also considerations that you need to think about in relation to your own skills, abilities, knowledge, and experience using apps and mobile technology. And as Lily mentioned a couple of times, regardless of the app that you are considering or that may have been recommended to you, definitely discuss the app with your healthcare team to make sure that they're aware that you're using it, so that if you are using it, they can take advantage of that and incorporate it into discussions that you have with them, but so that they can also give you feedback on their thoughts and whether or not they believe it's going to be effective for you. So we'll start with what Lily and I have kind of put together as 11 different general considerations for evaluating the quality of an app. And I will just briefly mention here that we have provided a handout to the Parkinsons Society Southwestern Ontario that they will make available afterwards if they haven't already. That does provide these considerations, so it's almost like a checklist that you can use afterwards when you want to use these quality criteria when you're evaluating apps that you're considering to use. So the first consideration is just very generally to think about who is the author of the app. And the author of the app will be described in whichever app store you're getting the app from under the information about the app. But is the author an individual? If it is an individual, what credentials do they have? Are they someone who is knowledgeable about Parkinson's disease? Is it an organization that has put the app together? So it's important to think about whether or not there's enough information about the author to understand whether or not it's coming from a credible source. The second criteria is to understand whether or not there was sponsorship or funding to develop the app. And again, this will generally be provided in that page on the App Store where information and details are provided about the app and the author of the app. And so the thing to keep in mind here is, are there any potential conflicts of interest that might be that could occur? So just to give a broad example, if it is for an app that helps to manage medication, was it developed by a pharmaceutical company, and are they overly promoting their pharmaceuticals within the app? So in that case, there would potentially be a conflict of interest depending on how they've actually gone about developing the app and delivering the information, as well as how the app's used. When was the app last updated? Older apps may not be compatible with all devices, so Lily had mentioned the updates, although they can be a pain sometimes, are certainly a big advantage. The fact that as new devices come out and operating systems are upgraded, that apps are actually keeping pace with those changes so that they can still be used on new devices. So when was it last updated? And ideally, apps should be updated on a regular basis, at least probably at least every 6 months to a year at a minimum, but certainly, as I'm sure you're all aware, apps can be updated even on a weekly basis. Does the app contain advertisements? Again, advertisements can be distracting, and they can even take users out of the app to external sites. So advertisements can sometimes be very well disguised within an app, and so you may not necessarily know that what you're clicking on isn't part of the app itself. And so usually when this happens, again, all of a sudden you'll be taken to a web browser, and there'll be some type of information trying to sell you a product or some other thing that isn't necessarily directly related to the app itself. Another thing to keep in mind, again, this information should be included on the description of the app in the App Store, but are the free and the paid features of an app clearly described? And in some cases, paid apps, so any app that you're actually having to pay money for, may offer free trials of them for a limited period of time, but after that trial, it either reverts to a free version with limited functionality, or you can't use it anymore until you've actually paid the amount. So it's important to keep that in mind in terms of whether or not that is clearly described, because you may get used to using an app after the trial, but not be aware necessarily that those functions might change. Another obvious thing that you can look at is how have current users rated the app. So there's lots, and usually on the App Store, depending on the specific app you're looking at, there will be a rating as long as it's met a minimum threshold. And so you will be able to see some comments as well as a star rating for each app. Now the thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the rating of the app is to be cautious when there are a lot of anonymous ratings, because sometimes there may very well be people who have been hired through various means to go and rate apps to give them a higher rating on the App Store. So you want to look at the ratings in terms of people who have actually provided their names, but provided detail as well as about their experience with the app. But you should always be cautious when you're looking at those ratings. Obviously, when an app has thousands or even hundreds of thousands of reviews, it's going to give you a better idea of the app's functionality and the experience of the users than if it has only 10 or 20 ratings. Does the app have an attractive user interface? And so this is an important consideration, because you are ideally going to be using this app on a regular basis. So something that is easy to use, that is intuitive, and that makes it fun for you to use, is going to help you to keep going back to the app and using it for its intended purpose. Another very important consideration is whether or not the app has a customer support mechanism. And a lot of the larger companies that develop apps usually have some type of either phone number or email that you can use for customer support. So if you are having difficulty using the app, you can follow up with them to get direct support. But some of the smaller companies, and if an app has been developed just by an individual, it's also going to have, it might not have a customer support mechanism. And so if customer support is something based on the type of app that you've downloaded, if that's something that's important, then certainly keep that as a main consideration before you download it and start using it. Right, so that's just kind of what I had described. The ninth criterion, does the app require network access to run? And so this is essentially asking, does the app require the internet to run, whether it's through Wi-Fi in your home or some other public location, or through mobile data? And again, depending on your mobile device, you may or may not have access to Wi-Fi or mobile data everywhere you go. And so depending on the function of the app, you need to consider whether or not it's going to be functional for you in all of the settings that you want to use it. Does the app require invasive permissions? And so you may recall when you're downloading an app, you're agreeing to certain permissions, and what permissions are exactly what they sound like. You're giving that app permission to access certain data on your phone. And so you have to be cognizant of what it's actually requesting from you, and whether or not an app might be overextending the type of permissions that it's actually requiring. And so is there any reason, for example, that an app would require access to your contacts, or would it require access to your camera on your mobile device? If the reason for downloading the app and the functionality of the app doesn't make any sense for the app to actually need those things, then you really need to be thinking about whether it's an appropriate app to use and download. And so yes, permissions should not extend beyond what's actually necessary to run the app. And those were just a couple of examples. So again, is it asking for something very intrusive like your SIM card details, or even your location? Now, if it is, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad app. You just have to make sure, and again, this will vary depending on the app, whether or not it makes sense that the app is requesting those things. So if an app is, for example, telling you where support groups are in the location that you are, that you live, where you live, then it actually makes sense for location permission to be used, because it will use your location and actually provide information about where support groups are. So permissions can be a little bit complex, and I know that sometimes people will just accept them without actually thinking about them, but basically you're giving that app and that developer permission to whatever it's being requested. All right. And number 11, is there available evidence, information from healthcare professionals? So this is again where you can take the app that you're interested in using to your healthcare team and actually get their feedback on whether or not they think it would be useful for you. And if you're familiar with doing some research on peer-reviewed articles, then you could also look to see if there have been any research studies done on that specific app. But as Lily mentioned, every day and every week new and new apps are being developed, and so it's very hard for research to keep pace in terms of evaluating these apps. So those are 11 general considerations for apps. But as I mentioned, there's two other things we need to consider. We need to consider you and whether or not using apps and mobile devices is appropriate for you, and also the healthcare team and their thoughts and feedback for you on a particular app. So let's look at those you considerations. So the first thing to consider is whether or not your condition has actually stabilized, and this is really consideration more generally. For example, if a person had an acute injury, is it really appropriate to be looking at apps if it's going to be a situation where your condition and your function is changing in a very short period of time? What are your own strengths and challenges? So are you having difficulty with dexterity? Do you have difficulty with vision? Are those things that might impact your ability to use mobile devices and apps? Or do you have other technologies or means of using apps and mobile devices that get around those challenges? But really thinking about what are your difficulties and what are your strengths, and do they allow you to use mobile devices, or is it going to be too much trouble to actually use them? Are you comfortable with technology? Although apps have become much more popular in the past decade, you need to think about whether or not apps are something that you are personally comfortable with using. And are you going to continue to use them on a regular basis to benefit from them if they do have the potential to benefit for you? And so in relation to this, you need to think about what your previous experiences of technology are. So have you used apps in the past but only ended up using them for a short period of time? Do you have your cell phone with you on a regular basis, or your tablet with you on a regular basis, that you're going to be able to use the app when you need to? An example might be if you're using an app to journal and keep track of how your symptoms change throughout the day. Do you actually have that mobile device and app with you regularly, or is it not something that is part of your daily life right now that you think you'll end up actually doing? Does your healthcare team support, and are they willing to get involved? So again, this kind of crosses over to that other consideration in terms of involving your healthcare team. The sixth consideration here is, what are your expectations of technology? Because again, sometimes the way that apps might be advertised or talked about by other people, they might kind of be overestimating the actual benefit or potential of an app, and so you need to make sure that you have appropriate expectations for what an app is actually going to help you do. Is the app a good solution considering financial resources? And so certainly there are apps that are free, there are apps that are only $1 or $2, but there are also communication apps, for example, that can be several $100s. And so finances is certainly something to keep in mind, and the cost of the actual devices that are used. So again, whether or not you have a tablet already, or if it's something that you would have to purchase, and whether or not you have a smartphone already, or if it's something you'd have to purchase. Can your family support you as well? And so it would be great if the app that you're interested in has some type of customer service mechanism where they can provide you with support, but they aren't going to be able to provide you that personal support on a daily basis. And so this is where family and friends come in. So are any of your family or friends able to support you? So are they able to also become familiar with the app so that they know how to use it and can help you if you run into any difficulty? So the key messages to take away from this section are to determine whether an app is a good fit for you. And again, that's absolutely crucial, because you don't want to use an app or start to pay for an app or pay for a mobile device if it's not something that is going to be a good fit for you. An app must provide you with adequate and complete information so that you can make an informed decision. So again, think about those different criteria that we talked about in terms of the reviews of an app, whether or not it has a customer support mechanism, whether or not there's embedded advertisements, all of those things. And certainly discuss the app with your healthcare team and family. And involving your healthcare team and family, again, is a way to receive additional support if you run into any difficulty, but also, especially with your healthcare team, to make sure that they're aware that you're using it and can potentially even incorporate some of the features or information that it provides into your treatment. So I'll turn things back over to Lily, and we're going to walk through a couple of examples now.
Well, thank you, Mike, for outlining those important considerations. And what Mike and I would like to do now is walk you through how then would we use those considerations to actually determine whether an app is appropriate or not. And we have chosen 2 specific examples that we believe may illustrate how these considerations can help you and your loved ones make these decisions. So the first app that we are going to discuss is an app called Instant Blood Pressure. This app was launched, and you probably can't see the description, but the way that it was described to people on their devices is that it allowed you to measure your blood pressure using only your iPhone with no cuff required. So that's how the app was described. And it is important for you to know too that this app was rated into the top 10, and not maybe rated is not the right word. It's actually, it was in the top 10 sales. So it was one of the most frequently downloaded and purchased apps in the App Store while it was available. And this app, I should also preface by saying it is not currently available, not this specific one. It was taken down as a result of some of the considerations we're going to walk through, but there are others like it. And currently, professionals and researchers are raising concerns given that some of these new apps, or even this same app, is now being relaunched by the developers. And the considerations and the concerns that caused it to be taken down persist. So this is an example that may be helpful for you as you walk through these things. So when we looked at this app, who was the author? So the author was a lab called Aura Labs Incorporated. However, in the description of the app, when you went through it, it said it was an app created and developed by Aura Labs and Johns Hopkins. So many of you may know that Johns Hopkins has a great reputation in terms of research and evidence in healthcare, and so this provided additional credibility. However, once this claim was studied further by medical professionals, it was actually the director of Aura Labs Inc. Actually had done a fellowship at Johns Hopkins, but in no way was Johns Hopkins involved in the development of the app. They didn't even know it was being launched. So it was interesting that some of these claims may not necessarily be accurate. So what we would encourage you to do in this case is also Google. Search the web and see what are there news related. So if you now were to Google this, you would find a lot of resources and news on any web browser that were actually raising concerns about this specific app and its author. Are there sponsors or funding to develop the app? It is unknown. So the description of the app makes no claim or description as to how the app was funded or whether this is a profit or non-profit organization. So that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad app, but it does raise some concerns, and it should invite us to investigate further. When was the app last updated? So as I said, in this specific situation, the app was taken down, but it's being reintroduced this year, 2017, after it was pulled out. And some of these concerns persist. While the app was out there, it was being updated approximately, it was updated twice in a year, which was somewhat concerning, given that the claims they were making is that it allowed you to measure your blood pressure with no cuff. And this information can vary from person to person, but also some of the latest evidence in terms of blood pressure measuring didn't seem to be incorporated, which raised some of the concerns of the medical community. Does the app contain advertisements? Did contain advertisements? Specifically, people reported seeing advertisements for, as Mike was mentioning, actually pharmaceutics that aim at controlling blood pressure. And then, are there free and paid features of an app clearly described? So there was no disclaimer as to whether you were going to make additional purchases. It seemed that it was just a one-time fee. However, the advertisements were persistent, and this also caused some concern. So how did the users rate the app? When we investigated this app, we also found out that only 3 out of 4 users had rated the app positively. But again, 4 reviews for an app that had made it into the top 10 of sales should cause some concern. So only 4 people had taken to the app store to actually rate it, even though it was one of the most sold apps. So that there already is a red flag. Did it have an attractive interface? It seems from navigating the app that it was very simple to use. Now this has to be weighed in terms of whether it actually does what it's supposed to. It did not have any customer support mechanism, nor could you contact Aura Labs. So they actually said that in their disclaimer that they could not provide any additional support other than what the readings the app was giving you. It did require network access to run, which could limit its use. It did not require what seemed to be any invasive permissions. However, even though the app didn't request specific information, it was recording healthcare data, and it was not clear as to how this data was being stored or used, given that it does require network access. So obviously the app needed internet to run, but it wasn't clear how the healthcare information of the user was being recorded, and that is concerning as well. And then this is I think the most concerning aspect that we found. Is there available evidence? Unfortunately, as I said, apps are launched at a rate that is impossible for research to keep up. But once it did, and this study was actually published this year, the app was found to be highly inaccurate, which is why it was pulled off the market. So it was found that actually the readings of blood pressure that people were getting were very much outside of what was actually true of those clients. There was a reporter, and if you were to Google this app, you will find that as a result of this study, a reporter actually contacted the CEO of this lab and tried to find out why they were making the claims they were making if it was so inaccurate. When done, what the person said is that this app was for entertainment purposes only. And so people could sort of play like they were making, they could read their blood pressure, but he said, oh, it is not meant to actually make those measurements. But the way that the app was described, launched, and marketed was actually for people with chronic conditions to monitor their blood pressure. So this could have resulted in a major problem for someone's healthcare. And we think this is a good example of things that are problematic with apps that are not carefully studied. So we would definitely say this is a situation where the app is not recommended. As I said, this is being relaunched again. But there are other apps out there. We actually did a search and found that there's many apps that claim to allow you to measure your blood pressure just the same. Some of them have been required if you read the description in the App Store all the way through the end, which I will also confess I don't often do. I just download it and I don't even want to read the agreement, the terms of agreement. But if you read through them, some of them we did find that at the end there's this very little sentence that says this app is for entertainment purposes only. So that's been a way in which the App Store and the Google Play Store have been able to at least make these claims transparent. But most of us don't necessarily read that far. So it is important that we understand, and I think we can all agree that the impact of a poor blood pressure tracking could be devastating for someone's health. This is another example that we looked at. So this is called the DAF Pro Stuttering and Parkinson's app. So it is meant to help people living with Parkinson's disease who are experiencing Parkinson's-related stuttering symptoms to be able to work through an intervention. So let's look at this app. Who is the author of the app is Speech Tools Limited. You can go through their website and navigate, and their CEO is a speech language pathologist who has participated in research before. So even though we could not make any claims or recommend this app, again, as a reminder, or if you recently joined us, this is in no way an endorsement of this app, but it seems to us that by applying this criteria, we're already seeing that credentials, as Mike was mentioning, are transparent, and that the people creating the app seem to have the training that is required to launch this intervention. Who are the sponsors or the funding? It is the owners who have funded the development of the app, and they make that disclaimer from the app description. The app was last updated December 7, 2016, as we were able to see on the app. So that information was also clear. The app does not contain advertisements, so it is meant to be used as part of someone's partnering with a speech and language pathologist, and it does not include any advertisements or additional products. It's a paid app, but it is paid in full. So once you pay your fee, you will have the app and all the updates as they become available. We only found 5 reviews, but on iOS, but on Android there was several of them. The average was 4+, so in a rating from 1 to 5, people had rated it either as a 4 or a 5, and there was several of those reviews available. So that also is starting to give us some idea that people are having more positive experiences and that there's more apps available. Some of these specifically, as Mike was saying, the reviews, if you read through them, the users were actually making comments regarding the attractive user interface, and they were saying that they had found it easier. I also found online that some of these reviews were being responded to by the developers. So if someone said, I'm having difficulty with this specific issue in the app, they were actually saying, you know, thank you for letting us know, we are studying this and we will make sure that the next update includes a fix for that. It does have a customer support mechanism, so they give you information as to who you can call, and they make themselves available to support users. It does not require network access to run, which may be a plus in terms of cost as well. It does not require permissions. It does require permission to use your microphone and your in your device, but as Mike said, this seems to us to be consistent with the nature of the app and what the app is trying to do. And then, is there evidence? So we couldn't find any specific evidence for the use of the app. The intervention method that the app makes available, we found several studies making allusion to the effectiveness of that specific intervention. So what this app has done is make it available on a mobile device. We also found very reassuring that in the description of the app, the developers specifically include a statement regarding that they recommend that this app be used in the context of a service of a certified speech language pathologist, so that people are not using this app on their own, but that they're actually partnering with an SLP, their SLP, in using this in intervention and having them make the recommendation. So again, this isn't an endorsement, but as you can see, and as we compare, there's really evidence to show that some of these considerations can help raise flags for you as you are discussing these apps, and that the impact that this could have is really great for your own health, as well as for your recovery and the outcomes that you're looking for. So just to close, Mike and I wanted to leave you with some resources. So as he said, we have made a handout available to you. So it's a checklist that you can use to evaluate apps. You can definitely feel free to share it with your healthcare professionals. We also would like to recommend, there is a website called iMedical Apps. So it is a team of medical professionals in the US that were very concerned about the amount of apps available for their patients. And they have created this non-for-profit website where they are committed to reviewing apps as medical professionals, to have specialists review each of the apps and to make clear what their professional opinion on each of these apps are and whether the claims that the apps make are actually feasible. So we would recommend that you use that. You can go in the website and actually search for the name of the app, and they would tell you what they have written. Some of these apps actually have multiple pieces written on each of them as the developers respond to their criticism. So they've been able to do a lot of advocacy. And then finally, Mike and I have published what we have shared with you today in the World Federation of Occupational Therapists Bulletin, which is the WFOT journal. And so the article is available at length, and it provides more information. So if you were interested in having a copy of that, or your healthcare professional is interested in a copy of that, please let us know, and we would be happy to make that available to you. So thank you very much, and I think we have some time for questions, and we would be happy to take some if you have them.
Well, that was just a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Liliana Alvarez and Mike Ravenek, for doing that. I think there was definitely some pros and cons that everyone got out of this webinar today, and those two apps that you did discuss were very interesting, and I think you know, as people start thinking about questions, hopefully that we can ask more about them. So if anyone does have any questions at this point in time, please enter them into the chat line below. We'll wait for about a minute or so, and if not, then I will continue on to announcements.
Maybe, well, you're all thinking about a question. I just will, sorry, I apologize. I will add some information about the DAF. So I mentioned that that is an intervention. It is called delayed auditory feedback. That's what DAF stands for. And that is the intervention for which there is evidence and that the app makes available. Just in case that is something that you were interested in looking further into, we just wanted you to have more accurate information.
Well, maybe we need to give people more time after the webinar to talk about questions. So I'll just go ahead and say thank you to Dr. Liliana and Mike Ravenek again for taking the time today to present this fantastic webinar. It will be available later on today or tomorrow for those of you who would like to watch this again, as well as the resources that Mike and Liliana have provided. They will also be available upon request. You can email me, Caitlin Garbett, Program Service Coordinator. My information is on our website at www.parkinsonsociety.ca. And last minute announcements, our next webinar will be on communications and Parkinson's on December 20th, same time as today, 12 noon to 1 p.m. We also have our October Care Partner Workshop on October 18th in Windsor. And then we also have our November conference coming up on November 11th here in London at the Helena Community Centre. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out and we would love to hear from you. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and on the screen you're about to also see our contact information, and so if you have any questions that you would like to direct to us, please also feel free to use that contact information.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.